On the night of September 27, 1965, a woman sat alone in a small bungalow in Culver City, California. She was 60 years old. The television was on, playing an old western. The only other person in the house was a nurse, asleep in the next room. The woman on the couch had once received 45,000 fan letters in a single month. She had once been the most popular actress in America, the #1 box office draw 2 years running, the face that launched 1,000 bob haircuts and 1,000,000 tubes of henna. Her name was Clara Bow, and at some point during that late-night movie, her heart stopped. When the nurse found her, the television was still on. Some accounts say the film playing was a Gary Cooper picture. If that's true, and it may not be, the detail has never been fully confirmed, then the last face Clara Bow saw on a screen belonged to a man she had loved nearly 40 years earlier. A man whose career she had helped create. A man who had died 4 years before her at exactly the same age. 60. But that is the end of the story. To understand how she got there, alone, in the dark, forgotten by an industry she had practically invented, we need to go back to Brooklyn, to a tenement on Bergen Street, to a room above a dilapidated Baptist church where, on July 29, 1905, during a brutal summer heat wave, a baby girl was born who nobody expected to survive. Clara Gordon Bow was the third daughter born to Robert and Sarah Bow. The first two had died, one after 2 hours, the other after 2 days. A doctor had warned Sarah not to get pregnant again. She did anyway, and by the time the labor was over, both mother and child were given up for dead. Clara didn't cry after she was born, and her grandmother, thinking the baby had died, shook her roughly. The baby woke up. Clara later said of that morning, "We were both given up, but somehow we struggled back to life." That phrase, "somehow we struggled back to life," could be carved over the whole of Clara Bow's existence. She spent every year of it struggling back from something. But the struggle started before she could walk. Her father, Robert, was a man she would later describe with painful tenderness. He had a quick, keen mind and all the natural qualifications to make something of himself, but didn't. He was frequently out of work, frequently absent. Between 1905 and 1923, the family moved 14 times, but rarely left the same neighborhood. Her mother, Sarah, had fallen from a second-story window at the age of 16 and suffered a severe head injury. She was eventually diagnosed with psychosis due to epilepsy, a condition that brought seizures, paranoia, delusions, and episodes of violence. From her earliest years, Clara learned how to hold her mother down during seizures, how to read the signs of a coming episode, how to make herself small when the house turned dangerous. She said her mother could be mean to me, and she often was, but that she didn't mean to be. She couldn't help it. Other children wouldn't play with Clara. Her clothes were ragged, her hair wild, her shoes often falling apart. She stuttered, which made her a target at school. She became a tomboy instead, running the streets with the neighborhood boys, using her fists when she had to. Her only real friend was a boy named Johnny who lived in the same tenement. When Clara was about 9 or 10 years old, she heard him screaming her name. She ran to his room and found him on fire. She grabbed a carpet and tried to smother the flames. She held him while he died. Years later, on Hollywood sets, directors would be astonished at Clara's ability to cry on command. She told people that all she had to do was ask the set musicians to play the lullaby "Rock-a-Bye Baby." It was the song Johnny's mother used to sing to help him fall asleep. Clara's one escape from all of this was the movies. She went to the picture houses whenever she could scrape together the money, and she would stand in front of a mirror at home imitating Mary Pickford. Something about the screen made the world feel survivable. She said, "For the first time in my life, I knew there was beauty in the world." And then, in 1921, when Clara was 16, a fan magazine called Motion Picture Classic announced a nationwide contest, the Fame and Fortune competition. The prize was a role in a movie. Clara persuaded her father to give her $1 for 2 photographs. She thought the pictures looked terrible. She entered anyway. Her mother's reaction was immediate and violent. Sarah Bow believed that actresses were no different from prostitutes. She told Clara she would be much better off dead. One night in February 1922, Clara woke up to find her mother standing over her bed holding a butcher knife to her throat. Clara fended her off and locked her in her room. In the morning, Sarah had no memory of what she had done. A few weeks later, Clara was notified that she had won the contest. The judges, among them the illustrators Howard Chandler Christie and Nasa McMine, wrote that she was very young, only 16, but full of confidence, determination, and ambition. They said she possessed a genuine spark of divine fire. The Brewster organization sent Clara to the Greenwich Village studio of a photographer named Nicholas Murray for a proper portrait to replace the cheap snapshots she had submitted. Murray shot her in 2 standard poses, one playful, with her thumb hooked beneath the rim of her red wool tam, and one pensive, gazing off camera. Dissatisfied, he ordered a 3rd setup. This time, Clara stared directly into the lens. Her hair swept across her forehead. Her lips pressed together, her face half in shadow, her eyes haunted. Here was the real Clara. It was the most beautiful and the most harrowing photograph anyone had taken of her, and it was exactly the one the magazine chose not to publish. They ran the playful one instead. The January 1922 issue of Motion Picture Classic announced her victory under the headline, "A Dream Come True." Clara described the audition day years later. "I hadn't dressed up because I had nothing to dress up in. I had never had a manicure nor a pair of chiffon stockings in my life. I wore the one and only thing I owned, a little plain wool dress, a sweater, and a woolly red tam. I had only looked at my face, and that was disappointment enough." The prize was a small part in a film called Beyond the Rainbow. Clara invited her friends to the premiere. She sat in the dark theater waiting to see herself on screen. When the lights came up, her scenes had been cut, every one of them. She was humiliated. She went home and cried. She thought her mother had been right, that the movie business was a lie, that she was a fool for believing in it. She nearly gave up, but she didn't. She dropped out of school. She had been attending public school 98 in Sheepshead Bay, and got an ordinary office job as a doctor's receptionist, while spending every spare hour going from studio to studio, agency to agency, begging for work. They told her she was too young, too short, too fat. When she mentioned the contest, they laughed. "The woods are full of girls who'd won some bum beauty contest," she was told, "and they were mostly dumb or they wouldn't have been in any beauty contest in the first place." Meanwhile, her mother was getting worse. Sarah was committed to a charity hospital. On January 5, 1923, she died. She was 43. Clara screamed at the family members who showed up for the funeral, calling them hypocrites for never caring about Sarah when she was alive. She blamed herself for her mother's death for years afterward, convinced somehow that her ambition to act had been the cause. But the movies kept calling. Clara had landed a small role in Down to the Sea in Ships in 1922, a whaling picture shot in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And this time, her scene stayed in. The film featured a scene in which Clara gets into a fistfight, and she threw herself into it with the kind of authenticity that only a girl who had grown up fighting on Brooklyn's sidewalks could bring. Critics noticed. One reviewer called her different from the other newcomers, more ambitious, more willing to be rough, more real. A producer named B.P. Schulberg saw it too. Schulberg ran a small outfit called Preferred Pictures, and he had an eye for raw talent. He signed Clara and gave her a train ticket to Hollywood. When she arrived at the studio, Schulberg was taken aback. She was wearing her only outfit, a shabby dress, worn shoes, and looked nothing like the polished young women who populated Hollywood. He was almost unwilling to give her a screen test. But when he saw her on film, the hesitation vanished. There was something there, something the camera loved, and the audience couldn't look away from. Director Clarence Badger would later say that the camera seemed to cause Bow to grow, that at 5'3.5", a little plump by the flat-chested standards of the day, she somehow became enormous on screen. Clara's father followed her to Hollywood, and they lived together in a small place on North Kingsley Drive. When Schulberg learned that a female friend of Clara's was also living there, he fired the friend from the studio, afraid the arrangement might create a scandal for his rising star. It was an early indication of something that would define Clara's entire relationship with the studio system. They wanted her energy, her wildness, her sex appeal, but only on their terms, only on screen, never in her actual life. And the pace they set was brutal. In 1924, Clara landed the role of a flapper named Janet Oglethorpe in Black Oxen, an adaptation of a best-selling novel. More than 50 women had auditioned. Director Frank Lloyd said that when Clara walked into his office, a big smile came over his face and he looked just tickled to death. He told the press she was the personification of the ideal aristocratic flapper, mischievous, pretty, aggressive, quick-tempered, and deeply sentimental. The picture was a hit. Clara was named one of the Wampus Baby Stars that year, an annual list of promising young actresses chosen by the Western Association of Motion Picture Advertisers. She was 19 years old and already being recognized as a new kind of screen presence. By 1925, the pace had become staggering. She appeared in 14 pictures that year, 6 for preferred and 8 on loan to other studios. She worked 18-hour days, sometimes shuttling between 2 or 3 productions at once. She later said, "I worked in 2 and even 3 pictures at once. I played all sorts of parts in all sorts of pictures. It was very hard at the time, and I used to be worn out and cry myself to sleep from sheer fatigue." Motion Picture Classic magazine put her on its cover and wrote that she showed alarming symptoms of becoming the sensation of the year. But Clara herself was far less certain. She confided to a reporter, her big round eyes filling with tears, "I'm almost never satisfied with myself or my work or anything. By the time I'm ready to be a great star, I'll have been on the screen such a long time that everybody will be tired of seeing me." Nobody was tired of seeing her. And then everything shifted. In August of 1926, Clara signed a new 5-year deal with Paramount Pictures. Her salary would start at $1,700 a week and rise to $4,000. She was 21 years old. She told reporters she planned to leave the business when the contract expired. Nobody believed her. Now here is where we need to talk about a word. A single, 2-letter word that would follow Clara Bow for the rest of her life and beyond it. The novelist Eleanor Glynn had coined a concept she called it. A kind of magnetic personal quality, not exactly beauty, not exactly sex appeal, but something more fundamental. A force that drew all others in. Glynn had published a serialized story about it in Cosmopolitan, and Paramount paid her $50,000 for the concept, gave her a cameo in the film, and built a movie around Clara Bow. The film was called simply It. In the picture, Clara plays Betty Lou Spence, a shopgirl who sets her sights on the handsome owner of the department store where she works. The plot was a trifle, a Cinderella story dressed up in jazz-age fashion. But none of that mattered. What mattered was Clara. She was funny and bold and tender and completely unpredictable. She didn't act the way other actresses acted. She moved differently. She seemed to be making it up as she went along, which in many cases she was. Her fellow star Louise Brooks later said, "Everything she did was completely original. Sliding across a desk it was just her." Glynn had declared that only 4 people in Hollywood had it. Clara was the only woman on the list. The other 3, including the doorman at the Ambassador Hotel and, believe it or not, a horse, were forgotten overnight. Clara Bow was now and forever the It Girl. The film was released in February 1927 and broke box office records across the country. The New York Times called her vivacious and saucy. Variety said she was really the whole show. Dorothy Parker, in her inimitable fashion, quipped about Bow's character. It hell, she had those. That same year, Clara starred in Wings, a war picture directed by William Wellman. The script had been rewritten to include a role for her, because she was Paramount's biggest star, but she wasn't happy about it. She called it a man's picture and said she was just the whipped cream on top of the pie. She was right about the pie. Wings went on to win the very first Academy Award for Best Picture. But she was wrong about her contribution. The film is remembered in part because of her. It was during the months-long production of Wings, filmed largely at Kelly Field in San Antonio, Texas, that Clara met a tall, quiet young actor with a 2-minute role in the picture. His name was Gary Cooper. He played a doomed cadet who smiles once, walks out of a tent, and is killed off-screen. That smile effectively launched his career, and his affair with Clara Bow began almost immediately. The production of Wings took 9 months. The cast and crew stayed at the St. Anthony Hotel in San Antonio, and director Wellman later recalled the whole experience as a kind of romantic chaos. Clara was technically engaged to director Victor Fleming. She had accepted his ring the day after arriving in Texas on September 16, 1926, but that didn't stop her from taking up with Cooper. By several accounts, she also flirted freely with other cast members and with some of the military pilots who served as extras and flight consultants. Clara was open about her affections in a way that few women in Hollywood dared to be. She never pretended. She called her relationships engagements, and she collected them the way other people collected autographs. Cooper was 25 years old and virtually unknown. Clara was the biggest star in Hollywood. She helped him get a featured role in Children of Divorce, another Paramount picture that year, and made sure he appeared briefly in It as well. 3 films together in a single year. People who knew them both said the affair was intense and affectionate. Clara was, in later years, reported to have praised Cooper for qualities that had nothing to do with his acting. She was also said to have mentioned, with some fondness, that he let her dogs join them in the bath. The affair eventually cooled, as Clara's relationships always did. Cooper moved on to Lupe Velez, and then to a long career that would make him one of the most enduring stars in movie history. But the connection between them, the it girl and the lanky Montana boy she had helped make famous, would stretch invisibly across the rest of both their lives. Meanwhile, Clara's romantic life was becoming a spectacle all its own. She was linked to the actor Gilbert Roland, who called her Dear Clarita and appeared to be genuinely devoted to her. She had a relationship with Bela Lugosi, the Hungarian actor who had not yet played Dracula, and Lugosi reportedly kept a nude portrait of Clara hanging in his bedroom for the rest of his life. When Lugosi's wife, Beatrice Weeks, sued for divorce in 1929, she named Clara as the cause of their separation. Clara was also briefly and publicly linked to Harry Richman, a cabaret performer and former piano accompanist for Mae West. Their engagement was announced in the newspapers. It was canceled shortly afterward. The press loved every minute of it. And there was the USC football team. In the late 1920s, Los Angeles was still, culturally, something of a small town, and USC football was the most exciting thing going. Clara befriended the players. She hosted post-game parties at her house, parties with food, dancing, card games, music. Stories circulated, as stories always did when Clara was involved, and the wildest of them. An allegation involving Clara and the entire team in a single night persisted for decades before Clara's biographer David Stenn definitively debunked it as pure fabrication. But the damage was done. The rumor took on a life of its own. It was repeated in bars and dressing rooms, and eventually in Kenneth Anger's notorious book Hollywood Babylon, which ensured it would outlive the truth by generations. The pattern was always the same. Clara lived her life out in the open. She drank, she smoked, she gambled, she had affairs, and she didn't lie about any of it. In an industry where every other star signed morality clauses and then broke them behind closed doors, Clara's sin was transparency. She was doing exactly what her male colleagues did, but she was a woman, and she was poor, and she was from Brooklyn, and she didn't know how to pretend to be something she wasn't. By the end of 1927, Clara Bow was making $250,000 a year. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote in Motion Picture Magazine that thousands of flappers patterned themselves after her. Pretty, impudent, superbly assured, as worldly wise, briefly clad, and hard-burled as possible. Her signature look, the tousled red bob, The Cupid's bow lips drawn in a heart shape, the Cupid doll eyes, was copied by women across the country. When fans discovered she used henna in her hair, sales of the dye tripled. Women said they were putting their Clara Bow on when they applied lipstick. She was, by every measure, the biggest movie star in America. In January of 1929, she received more than 45,000 letters from fans in a single month, a figure that, by some accounts, has never been equaled. Her presence in a film was said to guarantee investors, by odds of almost 2-to-1, a safe return. In 1928, her salary rose to the top of the industry. Paramount could not make films fast enough to satisfy the demand for her. She appeared in Red Hair, Ladies of the Mob, The Fleet's Inn, and 3 Weekends, all in a single year. And tragically, all 4 of those films are now lost, destroyed by time and the negligence of the studios that made them. Of Clara Bow's 58 films, 11 are completely lost, and 14 survive only as fragments. The woman the whole world wanted to watch can now only be seen in roughly half of the movies she made. The characters Clara played were almost always working girls: shopgirls, waitresses, manicurists, salesgirls. They were unabashedly flirty and quick to stick up for the bullied or give a lecherous man a sock on the jaw. They were, in other words, versions of Clara herself. She brought her own clothes to the set sometimes. She altered costumes with scissors to make them sexier, cutting off sleeves, slitting necklines, ignoring the designs that Edith Head, then an unknown young costumer at Paramount, had prepared for her. She didn't follow blocking directions so much as ignore them. The Paramount producer Bud Schulberg, BP's son, wrote that she gave off sparks and compared her, not entirely kindly, to a puppy that his father had trained to become Lassie. Director William Wellman was more generous, but just as frank. Movie stardom isn't acting ability. It's personality and temperament. I once directed Clara Bow. She was mad and crazy, but what a personality. Her influence bled far beyond the screen. Max Fleischer's cartoon character, Betty Boop, the big-eyed, cupid-lipped, spit-curled animated siren who first appeared in 1930, was modeled in part on Clara's appearance, combined with the voice of the singer Helen Kane. Clara Bow lived long enough to see herself turned into a cartoon, which is a particular kind of immortality. Whether she found it flattering or strange, nobody recorded. But there was a cost to being America's Cinderella, and Clara was beginning to pay it in ways that didn't show up on screen. Her father, Robert, had followed her to Hollywood and proved to be a constant source of embarrassment. Clara supported him in a series of failed businesses. He hung around her sets, trying to pick up young women by telling them his daughter was Clara Bow. Schulberg's people had to manage him like a second full-time job. Clara loved him. She always loved him. But he was a weight she couldn't put down. And there was the matter of money. Clara was earning enormous sums, but she had no idea how to manage them. She spent lavishly, on clothes, on cars, on entertaining, on anyone who asked. She was generous to a fault, the kind of person who would hand a $100 bill to a stranger who told a sad story. By the late 20s, despite her income, she was lurching toward financial trouble. In 1930, while filming in Nevada, Clara went gambling with Will Rogers at the Calneva Lodge in Lake Tahoe. She didn't know the rules. She ran up a debt of $13,500. When she refused to pay, not understanding perhaps that gambling debts were real debts, the story hit the newspapers. More bad publicity, more proof to the Hollywood elite that Clara Bow was a liability. And then came the doctor. While hospitalized with appendicitis, Clara developed a crush on a young intern named Earl Pearson. Whether the relationship went beyond infatuation is unclear, but it didn't matter. Pearson's wife sued for divorce, naming Clara Bow as the cause of alienation of affections. The case went to court. Clara was, once again, front-page news for all the wrong reasons. And yet, there was a line Clara once said in an interview, and it is the single most revealing thing she ever uttered about herself. She was talking about flappers, about the girls who loved her movies, and she said, "All the time the flapper is laughing and dancing, There's a feeling of tragedy underneath. She's unhappy and disillusioned, and that's what people sense. She could have been talking about any of her characters. She was talking about herself. Because the thing about Clara Bow that nobody understood, not the studio, not the press, not even most of her friends, was that her joy was not effortless. It was an act of will. It was a girl from a tenement in Brooklyn who had watched her friend die in her arms and woken up with a knife at her throat, deciding every single day to be the most alive person in the room. And the cost of that performance, on and off the screen, was accumulating in ways that nobody could see. She did not play the Hollywood game. She didn't attend the right parties. She didn't modulate her accent or learn to speak in the mid-Atlantic purr that the studio system demanded. She showed up at events in whatever she felt like wearing. She cursed freely. She gambled. She had loud, visible affairs. Bud Schulberg, the son of her producer B.P. Schulberg, wrote in his memoir that the Hollywood elite were cultural schizophrenics, and that Clara Bow, with her Brooklyn accent and her working-class manners, was a reminder of the origins they were all desperate to forget. The fancy hostesses of Beverly Hills kept her off their guest lists. She was welcome on their screens, but not at their tables. She was never invited to her own premieres. This was the central paradox of Clara Bow's Hollywood years. She was the most popular woman in America, and also, in the social world she inhabited, a pariah. The other actresses had come from similar backgrounds. Many of them were small-town girls or immigrants' daughters. But they had learned to perform respectability. Clara either couldn't or wouldn't. She lived in a modest 7-room house at 512 North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills, not a mansion. People who visited described it as a non-stop open house. Poker games in the living room, friendly cops dropping by, bootleggers stopping in, stray dogs everywhere. Clara collected dogs the way she collected people, with undiscriminating affection. Her home was chaotic and warm, and nothing like what a movie star's home was supposed to be. People who worked with her on set told a different story from the one the gossip column sold. She was generous, kind, and loyal to the crew. She brought sandwiches to the grips. She remembered everyone's name. She would sit on the curb outside the soundstage eating lunch rather than retreat to a private dressing room. Director Frank Lloyd said she was the personification of the ideal aristocratic flapper, and seemed baffled that the real Clara bore no resemblance to an aristocrat of any kind. The journalist Adela Rogers St. John's, who knew her well and wrote several pictures with her, observed that there seemed to be no pattern, no purpose to her life. She swings from one emotion to another, but she gains nothing, stores up nothing for the future. She lives entirely in the present, not even for today, but in the moment. That description, living in the moment, sounds romantic when you read it in a fan magazine. What it actually looked like, by the late 1920s, was a woman coming apart. Clara later said of this period, "I was running wild, I guess, in the sense of trying to have a good time. Maybe this was a good thing because I suppose a lot of that excitement, that joy of life, got onto the screen. Maybe. Or maybe the excitement on the screen was the only kind she could afford. A joy performed for cameras because there was no way to feel it in the dark, in the silence, in the hours after the set lights went down and she was alone with everything she had survived." In 1929, sound arrived, the talkies. For some silent film stars, the transition was fatal. John Gilbert's high voice ended his career. Vilma Banky's accent proved impossible. Paula Negri couldn't shed her European inflections. Clara's voice was fine. It was sassy and warm and unmistakably Brooklyn. Her fans didn't care about the accent, but Clara cared about the microphone. Her first talking picture was The Wild Party, directed by Dorothy Arzner, the first sound film Paramount ever made. Arzner was one of the very few female directors in Hollywood, and she was patient with Clara. But patience could only do so much. Clara was visibly terrified. During take after take, her eyes kept drifting upward to the overhead microphone, a large suspended apparatus that hung above the actors like a surveillance device. She couldn't stop looking at it. The fixed mic was the opposite of everything she was as a performer. It required stillness, precision, staying in one spot. Clara's whole art was movement, improvisation, spontaneity, the whirlwind of a body in motion. She said, "I hate talkies. They're stiff and limiting. You lose a lot of your cuteness because there's no chance for action, and action is the most important thing to me," she added, with the kind of blunt resignation that was pure Clara. "I can't buck progress. I have to do the best I can." She got through the film. She got through several more. Paramount reportedly gave her 2 weeks to prepare for the Wild party, 2 weeks to learn an entirely new medium. She took voice lessons, practicing what she called real refined diction, and she even began to sing in a couple of her talking pictures, warbling competently in Love Among the Millionaires and Paramount on Parade, both released in 1930. The Wild Party, Dangerous Curves, and The Saturday Night Kid were all released in 1929, and all were hits. She remained the #1 box office draw. In 1930, she was second only to Joan Crawford. Her voice was not the problem. The problem was everything else. By October of 1929, Clara described her nerves as all shot and said she had reached the breaking point. A journalist from Photoplay visited her home and reported rows of sedative bottles beside her bed. She couldn't sleep. She had never been able to sleep, not since that night with the knife. But now it was getting worse. She was making 4 pictures a year while fighting insomnia, anxiety, and an exhaustion so deep it left her shaking. And then, in the middle of all of this, 2 people entered Clara Bow's life who would, between them, bring her world crashing down. The first was Daisy DeVoe, a former hairdresser who became Clara's personal secretary and closest confidant. DeVoe took over Clara's finances, opened a special account for her paychecks, paid her bills, and, in a remarkably short time, pulled Clara from the brink of bankruptcy into something like financial order. Clara trusted her completely. The second was Rex Bell, born George Francis Beldam, a handsome young cowboy actor from Chicago who had come to Hollywood hoping to be the next Tom Mix. Bell was sincere, protective, and devoted. He fell in love with Clara, and she with him. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely decent man. But Bell and DeVoe despised each other. They circled Clara like rival moons, each guarding their position, each suspicious of the other's influence. Bell won. In late 1930, he accused DeVoe of stealing from Clara and had her fired. When DeVoe asked for a severance payment, Bell interpreted it as blackmail and called the police. What followed was one of the most devastating public spectacles in early Hollywood history. DeVoe was arrested and indicted on 37 counts of grand theft. She was accused of withdrawing roughly $16,000 from one of Clara's accounts and taking jewelry, insurance papers, and personal correspondence. But DeVoe's attorney made a calculated decision. If his client was going down, she was taking Clara Bow with her. He introduced Clara's stolen personal papers as evidence. Every canceled check, every love letter, every private embarrassment was read aloud in open court. The trial, which began in January of 1931, became a circus. Newspapers ran front-page stories about Clara's spending. More than $350,000 in 20 months, on clothes, cars, and going out. That figure in current dollars is nearly $5 million. Her romantic history was cataloged and commented upon. Her lifestyle was dissected in detail that would make a modern tabloid blush. And then it got worse. A man named Frederick Gurnau, who published a scurrilous little tabloid called The Coast Reporter, saw an opportunity. Working with DeVoe, he produced a 60-page document titled Clara's Secret Love Life as Told by Daisy. The allegations included drug addiction, drunken sex sprees, bestiality, and worse, accusations so lurid and so baseless that they eventually led to federal obscenity charges. Gurnau tried to sell the document to Rex Bell for $25,000. When Bell refused, Gurnau mailed copies to Will Hayes, the head of Hollywood's censorship office, to Superior Court judges, and to local PTA officials. He was eventually sentenced to 42 months in Leavenworth Federal Prison. DeVoe was convicted on only one count, the theft of a fur coat, and served 18 months. But the damage to Clara was catastrophic. A forensic accountant had testified that $48,000 was unaccounted for in one of Clara's accounts, managed by DeVoe. The courtroom had heard about every man Clara had ever been with, every dollar she had ever spent, every late night and early morning. The judge eventually banned the mudslinging, most of it coming from DeVoe's corner, but it was far too late. Clara hadn't done anything except misjudge someone's character, and yet her reputation had been gutted in open court. Meanwhile, Gurnow's Coast reporter was still circulating. The rumors it contained seeped into the culture like ink into cloth. People who had never read the tabloid somehow knew what it said. Years later, decades later, the stories would still be repeated as fact by people who had no idea where they originated. In 1965, the year Clara died, the writer Kenneth Anger published Hollywood Babylon, a book that treated every lurid rumor as gospel truth and ensured that the lies about Clara Bow would outlive the woman herself by generations. Gurnow, for his part, was released from Leavenworth in 1934, violated his parole by driving drunk, and was sent back to finish his full 8-year sentence. He died in 1955, unmourned and unremembered. Here is the part of the story where everything might have been different. Clara Bow was 25 years old. She was still, despite everything, one of the top 5 box office draws in the country. Her talking pictures had been successful. Her fans remained loyal. A different person, with a different history, might have weathered the storm. Plenty of stars had survived scandal before. Plenty would again. But Clara Bow was not a different person. She was a woman who had never had a safe place in her life, who had carried every trauma since childhood without ever processing any of it, and who was now watching her most private moments served up for public consumption by someone she had trusted. The trial broke something in her that had been bending for years. In May of 1931, Clara was admitted to the Glendale Sanatorium. Her producer, B.P. Schulberg, the man who had discovered her, who had profited enormously from her work, who had been calling her Crisis-a-Day Clara behind her back, showed no sympathy. He pressured her to come back and finish her next picture. She tried. She showed up for a costume fitting and a private rehearsal with the director of her next assigned film, The Secret Call. But in the middle of it, she couldn't go on. She couldn't hold the performance together. The woman who had made 14 pictures in a single year, who had never missed a day of shooting, who had carried Paramount's bottom line on her shoulders for half a decade, simply could not do it anymore. At her request, Paramount released her from her final obligation, a picture called City Streets that would go on to be made with Sylvia Sidney instead. Clara was 25 years old. Her career, for all practical purposes, was over. Her contract with Paramount was terminated by mutual consent. B.P. Schulberg wrote to her afterward in a letter that reads like an epitaph for Hollywood's conscience. "It has never been my good fortune to have anyone as sweet and loyal, as conscientious, and as courageous to work for us as yourself." One might wonder where that appreciation had been during the previous 6 months when Clara was being publicly dismembered and Schulberg did nothing to help. Clara left Hollywood for Rex Bell's ranch in Nevada. She called it her desert paradise. 6 months later, in December of 1931, they eloped to Las Vegas, then still a small town, not yet the city it would become. In an interview 2 weeks later, Clara described her recovery: sleep, exercise, fresh food, open desert air. She sounded, for the first time in years, like a woman who could breathe. It might have ended there. The troubled star finds love, leaves Hollywood, rides off into the sunset on a Nevada ranch. A false completion, a happy ending. But the story kept going. Almost immediately, every studio in Hollywood except Paramount came calling. Mary Pickford, who had been a star when Clara was still running the streets of Brooklyn, stated publicly that Bow was a very great actress and wanted her to play her sister in Secrets. Howard Hughes offered a 3-picture deal. MGM wanted her for Red-Headed Woman. Clara agreed to the MGM script but pulled out when Irving Thalberg demanded a long-term contract. The last thing in the world she wanted was to be locked back into a studio system. In April of 1932, she signed a 2-picture deal with Fox Film Corporation for $150,000, a staggering sum in the depths of the Depression, when millions of Americans were out of work and entire banks were closing their doors. Clara told a reporter before filming began, "Nothing else except happiness and health count in this life. I have never had much of either, but I am going to find them both." It was the kind of thing she said, direct, unguarded, completely sincere, and it was the kind of thing that made interviewers love her, even as it made studio publicists cringe. The first film was Call Her Savage, released in November of 1932. Clara played a wild, half-Native American woman from Texas, a role that was in some ways perfectly suited to her. The picture did respectable business. Clara looked healthy. She had gained some weight, which the press noted with the particular cruelty reserved for women. But on screen she was still magnetic, still unpredictable, still Clara. For a brief moment, it seemed like the comeback might hold. The second film was Hoopla, released in 1933. It did less well. Clara was 28 years old. She looked at the schedule, at the publicity demands, at the microphones and the cameras and the reporters and the whole grinding machinery of fame, and she made a decision. She was done. Not temporarily. Not until she felt better. Done. It was a remarkably clear-eyed choice for a woman the industry kept calling unstable. She knew what the work cost her. She knew she couldn't afford to pay it anymore. And so she walked away from the only thing she had ever been truly good at, the only thing that had ever saved her. And she didn't look back. Not once in 32 years did she make another film. And here is where the story becomes something else entirely. Because the next 32 years of Clara Bow's life are not a footnote. They are the story. She and Rex settled into Walking Box Ranch, named after the walking box cameras used in early motion pictures, a nod to the industry that had made them both. The property eventually grew to encompass hundreds of thousands of acres of desert south of Las Vegas, stretching across the southern tip of Clark County, Nevada, into California. The original rough cabin was replaced by a Spanish colonial revival hacienda, a 12-room house with a 50 by 30-foot living room, a swimming pool with piped-in water, and its own electric generating plant. Rex called the headquarters Rancho Clarita, Little Clara's Ranch. From the upper floor, you could see Spirit Mountain rising out of the desert. The landscape was vast and silent, and the exact opposite of a Brooklyn tenement. Clark Gable and Carol Lombard visited. John Wayne came. Errol Flynn rode horses on their land. For a few years, it felt like a dream that Clara had earned, a life that was finally quiet enough to live in. Their first son, Rex Jr., called Tony, was born in 1934. He looked like his father and would grow up to become a lawyer, eventually serving as the district attorney of Clark County. Their second son, George, arrived in 1938. He took after his mother in appearance. Between the two boys, Clara lost a baby girl, a grief she bore privately and rarely spoke about. Rex encouraged her to stay busy, and in September of 1937, they opened a restaurant in the Hollywood Plaza Hotel on Vine Street called the It Cafe. They ran it for 6 years before selling. It was a modest enterprise, nothing glamorous. Clara was known to spend time in the kitchen. Her specialty was macaroni and cheese. But the signs were accumulating. Small things mostly, that only made sense in retrospect. Clara was having trouble sleeping, worse than before, worse than ever. She had never slept well, not since the night her mother stood over her with the knife. Not since those childhood years when any sound in the dark might mean danger. Now the insomnia was becoming something else entirely, something that swallowed whole nights and left her raw and trembling by morning. She developed persistent abdominal pains that no doctor could explain or relieve. She grew anxious about leaving the ranch. She began refusing to attend social events but also refused to let Rex go without her. She became possessive and suspicious in 1 hour, then withdrawn and unreachable the next. Friends from that period noticed the contradictions, but didn't know what to make of them. The woman who had once been the most socially fearless person in Hollywood was becoming afraid of people. The 1940 census captured a quiet portrait of the household at Searchlight. Rex Beldam, 35, ranch owner. Clara, 33, 2 small boys. Rex's mother, Daisy Beldam. Clara's father, Robert, listed as caretaker. A Norwegian nurse named Helga Kelly, and a servant. The nurse's presence, buried in a government form, tells its own story. Clara needed help even then, even in paradise. By the mid-1940s, Clara's condition had become unmistakable. She was withdrawn in ways that went beyond ordinary shyness or reclusiveness. She had episodes of intense anxiety that left her unable to function for days. The ranch that had been her refuge was becoming a kind of cage, the desert silence that had once soothed her now amplifying every fear. Rex, caught between his devotion to Clara and his growing political career, he was becoming a significant figure in Nevada Republican politics, moving toward a run for lieutenant governor, made a decision that must have been agonizing. He arranged for Clara to be treated at sanitariums. During this period, in the mid-40s, Clara attempted to end her own life. The details were kept private, shielded from the press and the public by a family that had learned, painfully, how quickly private suffering becomes public spectacle. In 1951, the ranch was sold. Clara and Rex had both left it by then. Rex for the political life that was pulling him toward Carson City and Las Vegas, Clara for the quiet rooms and careful supervision of medical facilities. The desert paradise was over. The Walking Box Ranch would eventually be acquired by the Bureau of Land Management and, decades later, placed on the National Register of Historic Places. But by then, the people who had built their dreams there were gone. In 1949, Clara was admitted to the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the most respected psychiatric hospitals in the country. It was there that she was given a formal psychiatric diagnosis, schizophrenia. Her chronic insomnia, the insomnia that had been with her since childhood, since the knife, since the fire, was attributed by the analysts to childhood trauma, which seems obvious in retrospect, but which Clara herself rejected. She did not want psychological explanations for her suffering. She wanted her stomach to stop hurting and her mind to let her sleep. The abdominal pains were considered delusional. The insomnia was considered a symptom. The whole of Clara Bow's inner life was flattened into a clinical label and filed away. Now, and this is important, that diagnosis has been questioned by every subsequent observer who has studied Clara Bow's history. She was not hallucinatory. She was not psychotic in the classic sense. What she was, by any modern understanding, was a woman with severe, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, compounded by decades of exploitation, public humiliation, and an industry that had used her up and thrown her away. The treatments she received, including, according to some accounts, electroconvulsive therapy, were the standard interventions of the era, administered with good intentions and crude understanding. The abdominal pains that her doctors dismissed as delusional were later attributed to atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, a physical disease that had been developing since her adolescence. Her heart, the autopsy would eventually reveal, bore the scar of a previous heart attack that had gone entirely undiagnosed. All those years of being told her pain wasn't real. All those years of being told it was in her head. And the whole time, her heart was quietly failing. But in 1949, the doctors called it schizophrenia, and that was that. Clara never returned to the ranch. She never returned to Rex, not really, though they never divorced and he never abandoned her entirely. She moved to a small bungalow in Los Angeles, attended by a live-in nurse named Estala Smith. Rex visited when he could, but his political life was accelerating. He was elected lieutenant governor of Nevada in 1954 and served until his death. Their sons were raised largely apart from Clara. Rex once told a reporter, in a statement that was probably meant to be kind but reads as devastating, "The emotional strain of her early years was just too much for her. She had to live a different life. She needs the constant care of a doctor." And so the woman who had been the most vibrant presence on any screen in the world became a recluse. She lived quietly in the bungalow on a modest street in Culver City. She read voraciously, serious books, big books, the kind of books nobody would have expected the it girl to read. She had once taken a speed reading course, and now she consumed Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, all 6 volumes, and William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. She kept up with current affairs through newspapers and magazines. She maintained a large correspondence, letters written in a careful hand to people who still remembered her, and some who had never forgotten. She swam in a small pool. She painted. She took up hobbies and abandoned them. The days had a sameness to them that would have been unimaginable to the girl who had once made 3 pictures at the same time. She went to the movies, but only to drive-ins, where she could sit in the car and watch from behind a windshield without anyone recognizing her. She adored Marilyn Monroe, saw in her, perhaps, something familiar, something she understood from the inside. She was so taken with Marlon Brando that she arranged to have him come to her bungalow to meet her. One wonders what those two talked about. The reclusive flapper and the method actor, separated by a generation but connected by something neither of them could easily name. The magnetism of damaged people, maybe. The way the screen forgives everything except ordinariness. In 1947, there was one last flicker of the old Clara. The radio game show Truth or Consequences ran a contest called Miss Hush, in which listeners tried to identify a mystery voice. The voice belonged to Clara Bow, recorded on tape, disguised just enough to be tantalizing. For several weeks, the whole country was guessing. When the answer was finally revealed, it produced a brief wave of nostalgia, a national pause, a moment of collective memory before the world moved on again. Clara was 42. She had been out of the movies for 14 years. Most of the people guessing had never seen her on screen. There was a Hollywood Walk of Fame star, too, awarded on February 8, 1960, at 1500 Vine Street. And in 1994, nearly 3 decades after her death, the United States Postal Service put Clara's face on a stamp designed by the caricaturist Al Hirschfeld. Small honors, late honors. The kind of recognition that comes when there is no one left to enjoy it. Her father Robert, who had worked as a caretaker on the ranch and later at a Las Vegas casino, retired and returned to California to live with Clara in 1955. He died in 1959, at 84. Clara had supported him for nearly 40 years, through failed businesses, through embarrassments on her sets, through everything. She had once described him with such tenderness. He had all the natural qualifications to make something of himself, but didn't. Everything seemed to go wrong for him, poor darling. The poor darling is the tell. Clara always forgave. She forgave everyone except herself. But Clara's biographer David Stenn later reported something about Robert Bow that Clara had apparently revealed during her psychiatric treatment. Something she had buried for decades. Something that reframes the whole story of that father-daughter tenderness. According to Stenn, Robert had sexually abused Clara when she was 16, during the period when her mother was institutionalized. The timing is devastating. It was the same period when Clara was winning the Fame and Fortune contest, when she was taking her first photographs, when she was daring to dream of a life beyond Brooklyn. The girl who had survived everything, poverty, violence, her mother's illness, her friend's death, had been carrying this as well. And she had carried it in silence, protecting the man who had done it, supporting him financially, housing him, calling him poor darling in interviews for the rest of his life. And there is something else, a detail that only becomes fully legible this late in the story. Clara's mother, Sarah, the woman who had called actresses whores, who had held a knife to her daughter's throat, had herself, according to Stenn's research, been a prostitute. The rage and the shame and the violence make a terrible kind of sense in that light. Sarah wasn't afraid of the movies. She was afraid of what she saw in them. A version of the exploitation she had known, dressed up in lights and glamour and offered to her daughter as a dream. The knife at Clara's throat wasn't madness. It was prophecy. Rex Bell died on the 4th of July, 1962. He was at a Republican rally in Las Vegas, launching his campaign for governor of Nevada after having served 2 terms as the state's lieutenant governor. He had complained earlier in the day of pains in his arm. He was with his brother Hodson when the heart attack struck. He was pronounced dead on arrival at Sunrise Hospital. He was 58 years old. Clara, accompanied by her nurse, attended the funeral in Glendale, California. The pallbearers and honorary pallbearers included a roster of old Hollywood names: Dick Foran, Bob Steele, Richard Arlen, the boxer Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum. Gilbert Rowland was there too, one of Clara's earliest loves, the man who had called her Dear Clarita his whole life and never stopped. The Dodgers owner Walter O'Malley attended. Ralph Edwards, the host of Truth or Consequences, paid his respects. It was a gathering of people from a world that was already disappearing. Clara sat through the service and then went back to the bungalow. It was one of her last public appearances. For her final 3 years, Clara watched television in her living room, wrote letters, and occasionally saw old friends who still remembered the way she used to light up a room. Her estate was valued at roughly $500,000, comfortable, though nothing close to what she had earned in her prime. She refused to write her memoirs on the grounds that there were things that might embarrass her 2 sons and their families. She said all the money in the world would not compensate for the embarrassment. It was perhaps the most selfless decision she ever made, and the most ironic given that her entire life had been spent having her private world exposed against her will. She once said, in a line that could serve as the title of everything she ever lived through, "Even now, I can't trust life. It did too many awful things to me as a kid." On September 27, 1965, Clara Bow died of a heart attack in her bungalow in Culver City. She was 60 years old. The television was on. She was alone, except for her nurse. The autopsy confirmed atherosclerosis. Her heart carried the scar of at least one earlier attack that nobody had ever caught. Her pallbearers included Harry Richmond, Richard Arlen, Jack Oakey, Buddy Rogers, Jack Dempsey, and Maxie Rosenblum. It was a group that might have headlined a vaudeville bill in 1928. Some of them had been young when they knew her. All of them were old now. After her death, Clara Bow was largely forgotten. The speed of the forgetting was itself a kind of violence. Film historian Leonard Maltin noted in 1999 that Clara Bow had been more popular in terms of box office dollars, in terms of consistently bringing audiences into the theaters, than Greta Garbo or Lillian Gish or any of the other great names of that era. She was right on top, he said. But being on top in Clara's case had meant being the most exposed, the most exploited, and the easiest to discard. She was not included in the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest stars when it was compiled in 1999, though she had been on the preliminary list of nominees. Film historian Kevin Brownlow left her out of his landmark book The Parade's Gone By Entirely, a comprehensive survey of the silent era that somehow managed to overlook its biggest star. It was Louise Brooks, Clara's fellow silent star, a woman of fierce intellect and absolute opinions who had known her in the 1920s, who wrote to Brownlow and admonished him for giving her an entire chapter while giving Clara nothing. Brooks had always understood something about Clara that most people missed. She had called her voice charming. Not too Brooklyn, she said, and declared that everything Clara did on screen was completely original. She knew that what Clara Bow possessed was not glamour or technique, but something rarer and harder to describe. A refusal, in the face of everything, to be anything other than fully alive. In 2024, nearly 60 years after her death, Taylor Swift named the final track of her album The Tortured Poets Department after Clara Bow. It was a song about the cycle of fame, how young women are lifted up, consumed, and replaced. The choice of Clara's name was not accidental. Swift understood the pattern, perhaps because she could feel its gravity herself. The it that Eleanor Glynn had tried to define with her magazine serials and her $50,000 concept, that magnetic quality that draws all others in. Clara Bow didn't learn it from a script. She brought it from a tenement in Brooklyn where nothing was safe, where the most dangerous person in the house was the one who was supposed to protect her, where the best friend she ever had died in her arms on a Tuesday afternoon. She turned all of that damage into light, and she projected it onto a screen, and millions of people loved her for it without ever understanding what it cost. And then the world moved on. Sound replaced silence. Scandal replaced stardom. A ranch replaced a mansion. A bungalow replaced the ranch. A nurse replaced the audience. The television replaced the screen. The lipstick went on in a heart shape. Millions of women had imitated it. Clara had invented it. In the end, she sat alone in a house in Culver City, with nobody watching, and the screen watched her instead.